Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into something really fundamental: fossils. You know, those remnants, those clues left behind by life from way, way back. Absolutely. We see them in museums, maybe pick one up on a beach, but yeah, imagine when people first found these things in rocks. What were they?
Right. It wasn't immediately obvious they were once living things. Took a while to figure that out.
For centuries, yeah. Some thought they just, grew in the rock. But you had thinkers like Herodotus, much later Da Vinci, sort of suspecting they were ancient life. But it was really Nicolas Steno in the 1600s who started putting it together scientifically.
How so? What was his breakthrough?
He basically proposed that organic stuff could get trapped in sediment layers and keep its shape as the sediment turned to rock. A huge step.
And wasn't Robert Hooke around then, too, looking at fossils?
Yes, and Hooke made that other leap, realizing some fossils look like nothing alive today. That's the first real inkling of extinction, the idea that species could just vanish.
Wow. But it wasn't fully accepted yet. Not widely. That really took Georges Cuvier in the early 1800s. He did meticulous anatomical work, comparing fossil bones to modern animals.
And that clinched it.
Pretty much. He provided really strong evidence that species had gone extinct. And crucially, he started classifying fossils systematically, like biologists classified living things. That really turned paleontology into a proper science.
So they went from being just weird rock curiosities, things dug up, which is what fossilist means, right, to actual scientific data.
Exactly. And the 19th century just exploded with fossil collection, museums filling up, becoming these vital libraries of past life.
And then King William Smith, the canal engineer, his story is fascinating.
It really is. Just by overseeing digging, he noticed something critical. Different layers of rock always had the same types of fossils in a predictable sequence. Layer A always had these fossils, layer B above it always had those fossils, and so on.
And that sounds simple, but I guess the implication was huge.
Massive. It meant you could look at the fossils in a rock layer anywhere and have a good idea of its age relative to other layers. Fossils became clocks, basically. Tools for dating rocks and mapping out geological history.
Okay, so not just evidence of past life, but tools for understanding Earth's timeline and how life changed over that time.
Precisely. They became key to unraveling both geological history and the history of life itself, its evolution. So, yeah, that's our mission for this deep dive. What are fossils? How do they form? Where do we find them? And what amazing stories do they tell about Earth's past? It's fundamental stuff for understanding geologic time.
All right, let's start with the basics then. Where are these fossils actually found? What kind of rocks should we be looking in?
Overwhelmingly, you find them in sedimentary rocks. So think sandstone, shale, limestone rocks made from accumulated mud, sand, or shells.
Makes sense. Stuff gets buried in sediment.
Exactly. You also find them sometimes in volcanic tuffs. That's basically hardened volcanic ash. Ash-burying things quickly can preserve them.
Okay, sedimentary rocks and some volcanic ash deposits. What about other rock types, like metamorphic or those big igneous intrusions? Are they fossil deserts?
Largely, yes. Metamorphic rocks, they've been cooked and squeezed, right? That whole process, recrystallization, shearing it, usually destroys any fossils that might have been in the original rock.
Wipes the slate clean, basically.
Pretty much. And intrusive igneous rocks, like granite, they form from molten magma cooling slowly underground. So first, no life down there to begin with, and second, the intense heat would obliterate anything anyway.
Right, no fossils forming in a magma chamber. But you mentioned volcanic tuffs. Is there any other weird volcanic exception, like lava?
There is a very rare one. If you have really runny, low-viscosity basaltic lava, the kind that flows easily, it can sometimes flow around, say, a tree trunk very quickly. If it hardens fast enough before the tree completely burns up, you can get a mold, essentially. A tree-shaped hole in the lava.
Whoa! A fossil mold made by lava. That's wild. Okay, still sedimentary. Let's get into the how. How does, say, a dinosaur bone turn into a fossil? What's that process called?
The process is called fossilization. And yeah, let's use a dinosaur example. It's classic. Imagine a dinosaur dies near a lake or river. Maybe scavengers come, scatter the bones a bit.
The messy reality of nature.
Right. But then maybe a flood happens or the river shifts course and it dumps a whole load of sediment, silt, mud over the bones. This burial is key.
Why is burial so important?
It protects the remains, protects them from more scavenging, from weathering, from being broken up by currents, from oxygen, which fuels decay. It basically puts them in a safe deposit box, geologically speaking.
Okay, so step one, die somewhere you can get buried quickly.
Pretty much. Then, over time, more sediment piles on top, layers and layers, the weight creates pressure. Meanwhile, water seeps through the ground and through the buried bones.
And this groundwater does something.
It does. Groundwater often carries dissolved minerals. As it flows through the porous bone, those minerals can gradually precipitate out, filling in the tiny spaces within the bone structure. Sometimes it even replaces the original bone minerals molecule by molecule.
So the bone itself is slowly turning into stone, but keeping its shape.
Exactly. That's permineralization, a common type of fossilization. And while this is happening, the surrounding sediment is also hardening under pressure and cementation, that's lithification. The mud becomes shale, the sand becomes sandstone, encasing the now mineralized bone.
And footprints, how do they get preserved?
Same basic idea. An animal walks on soft mud, leaves prints. If that mud gets gently buried by another layer of sediment before the prints are washed away, that impression can be preserved as the mud layers turn into rock. You get a mold of the footprint.
Okay, so burial, pressure, mineral replacement, lithification, and then millions of years pass. How do we end up finding it?
Tectonic forces lift those rock layers up, maybe forming mountains. Then erosion starts wearing away the overlying rock, wind, rain, rivers. Eventually, they expose the rock layer containing the fossil.
And that's when a lucky paleontologist walks by.
Or someone else. But yeah, paleontologists then carefully excavate it, maybe using dental picks and brushes, sometimes jackhammers for big stuff. They might encase fragile fossils in plaster jackets to transport them. It's painstaking work.
And sometimes these finds are huge deals, right? Like Sue the T-Rex.
Absolutely. Sue is one of the most complete T-Rex skeletons ever found. It tells us so much. And yes, it fetched millions at auction, highlighting the scientific and sometimes monetary value.
Incredible journey from a lakeside death to a museum display millions of years later. Now, we've talked a lot about bones and footprints, but fossils come in many other forms too, don't they?
Oh, definitely. What we've discussed, bones, teeth, shells, those are called body fossils, preserving part of the organism's body. But there's a whole range.
Okay, let's run through them. What else is there besides mineralized bones?
Well, sometimes, in really specific conditions, you get preservation of the actual organic material, or at least parts of it, like frozen fossils.
The woolly mammoths in Siberia.
Exactly. Frozen in permafrost for tens of thousands of years. You get skin, muscle, hair, incredible detail. But it's relatively young, geologically speaking. Same for dried or desiccated fossils found in super arid caves. Mummified, essentially.
So amazing preservation, but not reaching back hundreds of millions of years.
Generally not, no. Then you have preservation in amber.
Like in Jurassic Park.
Pretty much. Tree resin drips onto an insect or even a small lizard, hardens, and then over millions of years, that resin fossilizes into amber, perfectly encasing the organism. The detail can be stunning.
Nature's time capsule. What about things like tar pits?
Yeah, like the La Brea tar pits in LA. Natural asphalt seeps trap animals, and the tar inhibits decay, preserving the bones remarkably well. Again, mostly younger fossils, Pleistocene typically, but fantastic preservation of Ice Age animals.
Dire wolves, saber-toothed cats. Amazing stuff. Okay, so frozen, dried, amber, tar. Back to the more common rock-based fossils.
Right. Besides preserved hard parts like bones and shells, which might be original minerals or recrystallized, you get molds and casts.
Explain those again.
Okay, imagine a shell gets buried in mud. The mud hardens around it. Then maybe acidic water dissolves the shell away completely. What's left in the rock is a cavity shaped exactly like the outside of the shell. That's the external mold.
Like the impression left behind.
Yes. Now, if that cavity later gets filled up with new sediment or minerals and that hardens, you get a cast or replica of the original shell's shape.
Got it. Mold is the whole, cast is the filling.
You got it. Then there are carbonized impressions. These are cool. Think of a leaf or a feather falling into fine mud. It gets buried. As it decays under pressure, most of the organic molecules break down, but a thin film of carbon is left behind, outlining the original shape.
So you get these delicate black silhouettes on the rock.
Exactly. Really important for preserving things like leaves, fish, insects, things that don't have robust hard parts.
And you mentioned permineralization, earlier minerals filling pores. Petrified wood is like that.
Petrified wood is the classic example. Water-carrying dissolved silica, often from volcanic ash, seeps into buried wood. The silica precipitates out, replacing the wood structure cell by cell. It turns to stone, but you can often still see the wood grain, even tree rings, sometimes microscopic cell details.
That's incredible. Okay, so those are mostly body fossils. What about trace fossils? Evidence of activity.
Right. Trace fossils aren't the organism itself, but signs it was there. Footprints are the most obvious, telling us about size, gait, maybe even herd behavior, like those amazing Laetoli footprints in Africa, early hominins walking across volcanic ash.
Just stunning to see. What other traces?
Burrows tunnels dug by worms or shrimp or other critters in sediment, feeding traces marks left by organisms scraping or foraging on the seafloor. And coprolites.
Fossilized
Yeah.
droppings.
Yep. Fossil poop. Sounds funny, but they can tell you directly what an ancient animal was eating. Invaluable dietary information.
Okay, I won't look at rocks the same way again. Any other major categories?
There are also chemical fossils, sometimes called biomarkers. These aren't visible structures, but specific organic molecules produced by life that can survive in rocks for billions of years.
Molecules. Like what?
Like complex cholesterol-related molecules that only certain types of organisms make. Finding those molecules in ancient rock is evidence that type of life existed then, even if no body fossils are found. Also, isotopic signatures life processes can slightly alter the ratios of isotopes, like carbon-12 and carbon-13, and we can measure that in rocks.
Wow. So even chemical traces count as fossils.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned size.
Yeah, simple distinction. Macrofossils are big enough to see with the naked eye, like most of the things we've discussed. Microfossils need a microscope. Things like fossilized plankton shells, foraminifera, diatoms, pollen grains, tiny spores. Hugely important for dating rocks, especially in oil exploration and understanding past environments.
Okay, a huge variety then. But you stressed earlier that becoming a fossil is actually pretty rare. Why is that? What boosts an organism's preservation potential?
It really is the exception, not the rule. So many things have to go right. The biggest factor is probably rapid burial. If you die and just lie on the surface, chances are you'll decay, get eaten, or weather away completely. You need to be covered by sediment quickly.
Protects you from the elements and scavengers. Makes sense.
Second, the energy of the environment. A quiet spot, like the bottom of a calm lake or deep sea, is much better than a high-energy beach with crashing waves or a fast-flowing river that will just bash remains to pieces.
Gentle burial is best.
Definitely. Third, having hard parts helps enormously.
Yeah.
Bones, shells, teeth, they just last longer than soft tissues like skin or muscle. That's why the fossil record is heavily biased towards things with skeletons or shells.
So jellyfish fossils are much rarer than clam fossils.
Way rarer. And fourth, oxygen levels matter. If the environment where you're buried is low in oxygen, anoxic conditions, decay happens much, much slower because the bacteria that do most of the decomposing need oxygen.
Okay, so the recipe for good fossil potential: have hard parts, die somewhere quiet and low oxygen, and get buried fast.
That's the ideal scenario, which is why paleontologists get so excited about extraordinary fossil sites, places where conditions were so good that even soft parts got preserved sometimes.
Yes, you mentioned these Ligerstätten. Like where?
The Messel pit in Germany is amazing. It was a toxic, stagnant lake about 49 million years ago. Animals that fell in were preserved incredibly well. You can see fur outlines on mammals, feathers on birds, even stomach contents sometimes.
Unbelievable detail. What else?
The Solnhofen limestone, also Germany, about 150 million years old. Famous for Archaeopteryx, the early bird, with clear feather impressions. It was a quiet lagoon environment, preserving delicate things like jellyfish and dragonfly wings, too.
Archaeopteryx is iconic. And the Burgess Shale.
Oh, the Burgess Shale in Canada is mind-blowing. Around 510 million years old, Cambrian period. It preserved an explosion of early, complex, soft-bodied animals, many of which are bizarre, like nothing alive today. It opened a window onto a really weird early chapter of animal evolution.
These sites sound like unique snapshots. So once we find these fossils, how do scientists actually classify them and figure out what they were? It's not always obvious.
No, it's definitely not. The basic framework is taxonomy, the science of classification. It goes back to Linnaeus in the 18th century with his hierarchical system: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and the two-part scientific name, genus and species.
The system we still use for living things.
Right, and Cuvier back in the early 1800s was really key in applying the system rigorously to fossils. For a long time, classification was based almost entirely on morphology, the shape and structure of the fossil.
So you compare the fossil shape to known living things or other fossils.
Exactly. Does it have a backbone? Okay, it's a vertebrate. Does it have feathers? Maybe a bird or a related dinosaur. Does it have a coiled shell? Maybe a snail, gastropod, or an ammonite, cephalopod. You look at the internal structure, the ornamentation. You look for key identifying features.
Like those diagrams you see showing the difference between a clamshell bivalve and a brachiopod shell. They look similar, but the symmetry is different.
Precisely. Bivalves usually have two identical or near identical shells, mirror images. Brachiopods also have two shells, but they're often different shapes from each other, and the symmetry runs through each shell, not between them. Little details like that are crucial.
And recognizing things like trilobites with their three-lobed bodies, or crinoids looking like stony flowers, or those saw-blade graptolites.
Yes, learning those key morphological groups is fundamental. Gastropods with their spiral shells, bivalves, brachiopods, bryozoans forming lacy colonies, crinoid stems made of little discs, graptolites, cephalopods like the coiled ammonites or straight nautiloids, corals. Recognizing the basic body plan is step one.
But what makes it tricky? Fossils are often broken.
Very often, you might only have a fragment. Or you run into issues of convergence where unrelated organisms evolve similar shapes because they live in similar ways. Like wings evolved independently in insects, bats, birds. Those are analogous structures, serving the same function but with different evolutionary origins.
As opposed to homologous structures.
Right. Homologous structures are features shared by related species because they inherited them from a common ancestor, even if they now serve different functions. Like the bones in your arm, a bat's wing, a whale's flipper. Same basic bone pattern, different uses, pointing to shared ancestry. Recognizing homology is key for true classification.
And some extinct groups are just weird, with no close living relatives.
Totally. Trilobites are a good example. They're arthropods, related to insects and crabs, but they form their own distinct class that died out completely. Classifying extinct groups with unique body plans can be challenging.
So it's detective work based on shape, structure, and understanding evolutionary patterns. Now, fossils tell us about individual species, but also about ancient environments, right? Paleoecology.
Exactly. Organisms don't live in isolation. They're part of communities interacting with each other and their environment. That's an ecosystem. What lives where depends on climate, water, nutrients, all sorts of factors.
And fossils found together can tell us about that ancient ecosystem.
Yes, the assemblage of fossils in a rock layer gives you clues. If you find coral fossils, certain types of algae, and shells of animals known to live in reefs today, you can infer it was likely a shallow, warm, clear water marine environment similar to a modern reef.
You compare the ancient community to modern ones.
Right. We look at the types of organisms were they primary producers making their own food, like algae, or consumers, herbivores, carnivores, decomposers. We try to reconstruct the food web. We also look at the rock itself. Was it deposited in deep water, shallow water, a river, a desert? Combining the fossil evidence with the geological evidence helps paint a picture of the paleoecology.
It's like reconstructing a whole lost world. Which brings us to the really big picture. Evolution and extinction. The grand narrative told by the fossil record.
It's the ultimate proof, really. The fossil record shows us undeniable fact that life has changed dramatically over Earth's history. Species appear, thrive for a while, and then disappear, replaced by others. It's a dynamic story, not a static picture.
But it's not a perfect record, is it? You mentioned incompleteness.
Hugely incomplete. Think about it. Billions of species might have existed. We've identified maybe 250,000 fossil species. That's a tiny fraction. So many organisms never fossilized, or their fossils were destroyed or haven't been found yet. It's like having only a few frames from a very long movie.
But even those frames show change. And sometimes you find missing links, transitional fossils.
Yes, those are incredibly important. Fossils like Archaeopteryx, showing a mix of reptile-like features, teeth, claws, bony tail, and bird-like features, feathers, clearly demonstrate evolutionary transitions between major groups. They show common ancestry in action.
So why is the record so patchy? You mentioned preservation potential.
That's a big part. Soft-bodied things rarely fossilize. Burial has to be rapid. Environments change, so sedimentation isn't continuous everywhere. Sea levels rise and fall, exposing land, then flooding it again. There were just lots of gaps in the rock record itself, meaning gaps in the fossil record.
Okay, so this record of change is what Darwin drew upon, right? His big idea.
Absolutely. Darwin's voyage on the Beagle was key. Seeing those finches on the Galapagos, slightly different on each island, adapted to different foods, it sparked the idea that they must have come from a common ancestor and then changed, diversified to fit their specific island environment. Adaptive radiation, we call it.
And Lyell's geology gave him the necessary deep time for this slow change.
Exactly. Lyell showed the Earth was incredibly old, shaped by slow, gradual processes. That gave Darwin the timescale needed for evolution to work. He proposed that variations naturally exist in populations, they're heritable, and the environment selects which variations are advantageous.
Natural selection. Survival of the fittest, in a way.
Right. Individuals with traits better suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce, passing those traits on. Over generations, the population changes, adapts. Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently came up with a similar idea, provided the mechanism.
And this theory is now like the bedrock of biology.
Absolutely. Supported by mountains of evidence from fossils, genetics, anatomy, embryology, everything points to evolution by natural selection as the driving force behind life's diversity.
And genetics later provided the how mutations, creating variation, DNA passing it on.
Precisely. Discovering DNA and how genes work filled in the mechanistic details Darwin didn't know. Now, there was some debate about the pace of evolution, wasn't there? Gradual versus...
Punctuated equilibrium.
Right. Darwin mostly envisioned slow, constant change gradualism. But Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge looked at the fossil record and saw long periods where species seemed to stay the same, stasis, punctuated by relatively short bursts of rapid change and speciation.
So maybe evolution happens in fits and starts sometimes, especially after big events.
That's the idea. Maybe after a mass extinction opens up ecological niches, or a population gets isolated, evolution can happen much faster for a while, followed by stability. It's likely both gradualism and punctuated equilibrium play roles. The tempo isn't always constant.
Okay. Now, the flip side of new species appearing is extinction, species vanishing forever.
It's the inevitable counterpart. Most species that have ever lived are now extinct. Cuvier convinced the scientific world it was real, and the causes are varied.
Like what? What drives species to extinction?
Lots of things. Climate change is a big one. If the climate changes too fast for a species to adapt or migrate, it might die out. Tectonic activity, continents moving, mountains rising, sea levels changing, alters habitats dramatically.
Catastrophes, too. Asteroids.
Definitely. A big asteroid impact, like the one linked to the dinosaur extinction, can cause global devastation dust, blocking sunlight, rapid cooling, food chains collapsing. Massive volcanic eruptions can also trigger climate change by releasing huge amounts of gas.
And competition. New predators.
Yes. If a new, more efficient predator or competitor arrives, it can drive existing species out. We see that today, often linked to invasive species introduced by humans. And historically, human arrival in new areas often coincided with extinctions of large animals, the megafauna.
So it can be gradual decline or sudden wipeout. And sometimes these extinctions are global and affect huge numbers of species at once, mass extinctions.
Right. The fossil record shows at least 5 really major mass extinction events in the last half billion years or so, where a huge percentage of global biodiversity disappeared relatively quickly. They often mark boundaries between geological periods.
Like the KPG event that got the dinosaurs?
That's the most famous one, 66 million years ago. Wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs, ammonites, many marine reptiles, lots of plankton. But the biggest one was actually the Permian-Triassic extinction, about 252 million years ago, the Great Dying. Upwards of 90% of marine species might have vanished. It was truly catastrophic.
And are we in one now? People talk about a 6th extinction?
There's a strong scientific consensus that we are. The rate of species extinction today, driven largely by human activity, habitat destruction, climate change, pollution, overexploitation, is hundreds or even thousands of times higher than the natural background rate seen in the fossil record. It's a serious concern.
A very sobering thought.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've seen how fossils show evolution happens. What specific lines of evidence from fossils support it?
Well, firstly, the sequence itself. We find simpler organisms in older rocks, more complex ones in younger rocks, matching the general pattern evolution predicts. Secondly, we see evolutionary trends within lineages, tracking changes in horses' teeth and toes over millions of years, for example. Thirdly, those transitional fossils we mentioned, showing links between groups. And fourthly, homology, those shared underlying structures, like the forelimb bones, that only make sense in the light of common ancestry.
It all paints a consistent picture. And now we have genetics, too, phylogenetics, to map relationships.
Exactly. Sequencing DNA lets us compare organisms at the most fundamental level and figure out how closely related they are. It's revolutionized our understanding of the tree of life. A group sharing a common ancestor is called a clade.
And this led to rethinking the main branches of life, the 3 domains.
Yes, Carl Woese's work comparing ribosomal RNA showed life isn't just plants, animals, fungi, etc. It's fundamentally divided into 3 domains. Bacteria, Archaea, both simple cells without a nucleus, prokaryotes, but genetically very different, and Eukarya, cells with a nucleus, including us, plants, fungi, protists.
So 2 whole domains of microbial life that are distinct from each other and from us eukaryotes. That's huge.
It really reshaped our view. Archaea often live in extreme environments, but both they and bacteria are incredibly diverse and found almost everywhere. Eukarya includes all the complex multicellular life we see, plus single-celled protists.
And the goal is to build the complete tree of life, showing how all these groups connect back to common ancestors.
That's the ultimate aim. We use diagrams called phylogenetic trees, or often cladograms, which focus on the branching points, to visualize these relationships based on both fossil evidence and genetic data. We have evidence of bacteria and archaea fossils and chemical signatures going back maybe 3.7 billion years, perhaps even earlier.
Wow, life got started early.
Seems so. The current thinking is that early life split into bacteria and the line leading to Archaea and Eukarya. Eukaryotes probably diverged later, maybe around 2.5 billion years ago, based on fossil protists. For a long time, Earth was basically a microbial planet.
When did complex animals show up?
Good fossil evidence for multicellular animals with tissues appears around, say, 600, 700 million years ago, though there are debates about potentially older, simpler forms. Then, of course, you get the Cambrian explosion around 541 million years ago, where most major animal body plans seem to appear relatively rapidly in the fossil record. But research is always ongoing, pushing back dates, refining relationships.
It's an amazing ongoing scientific detective story.
It truly is.
Well, we have really covered a massive amount of ground today, starting with just wondering what fossils were, all the way through how they form, the incredible variety of types.
Yeah, from frozen mammoths to microscopic pollen grains and those amazing Lagerstätten sites preserving soft bits.
To how we use them to classify ancient life, reconstruct ecosystems, and ultimately how they provide undeniable evidence for evolution and the reality of extinction, including those devastating mass extinctions.
We've touched on the core geology, the processes, the different types you'd see in diagrams, examples like La Brea or Bridges Shale that are like geological tours in themselves, and really how central fossils are to understanding Earth's entire history and the life upon it.
Absolutely. It feels like we've given a pretty thorough tour based on the kind of scope you'd find in a solid geology text. So to wrap up, here's something to chew on. Given how vast time is and how incomplete we know the fossil record is, what incredible creatures, what bizarre ecosystems, what completely unknown chapters of life's story might still be locked away in rocks somewhere just waiting to be discovered.
Makes you want to grab a rock hammer, doesn't it? There's definitely more out there.